Why is no one talking about the global waste gap? The United States of America is disproportionately fat. We distribute excess calories to starving countries. So this is just a play on the people talking about the wealth gap and the wage gap and just different things saying, oh, because of this inequality in the world, this group of people has too much of this resource and we need to redistribute this. And one thing to that I've simply said, the floor is always the floor. Poverty is always poverty. The difference is that the ceiling, the top floor, keeps getting higher and higher. Now we're in the top floor anymore. Now we're rocketing out into space. Now we're Elon Musk type of things where a private individual can now own a spaceship, can technically own a company that can take them personally to actually live in space. Yet the poor people, the person who's in poverty today, who's just absolute poverty at the floor, is still at the same floor as they were when the first human being actually was born. When we first had the Homo sapien. That floor is still the actual floor. And ostensibly, actually, when people think about the basic floor of poverty, that has even changed in and of itself. But I'm talking about just absolute poverty where it's like literally you have nothing. Having nothing is having nothing. The some things you can have has always increased. So as we have more advancement, there will constantly be an increase in the wage gap, in the wealth gap. That will always increase because the floor remains the floor. The top continues to be the top. Just how having no food whatsoever is always having no food whatsoever. Starving is always starving. No matter if you live in a place that's going through a drought or live in a place that just has food rotting because there's not enough people to eat it. So that's just a general thing with this thought. I came up with some slogans. If we can get this waste gap thing trending, there's some slogans also playing on just the general things I see talking about wealth and wage gap, the whole thing that's been disproven so many times, the difference, discrepancy between what males and females are actually paid in general. But then, not even. Okay, back to this thing. Okay, here's the first slogan. No one should have seconds until everyone in the world has firsts. Now, this is just a simple thing. And it's the whole idea of seconds, just think about it in your mind. When did you start thinking that meals that you have should have second servings? Or that should have even leftovers where you can have the next day? Like, how much of that is this? If you're listening to this, chances are you take that for granted. That's just a regular thing where you have the meal. But then there's also a different thing where when you go to a restaurant and people actually buy food, you normally just eat what you eat. But then normally when you'll be at home and you'll have the same meal and then the food will actually be out there in like the serving dishes, people will normally have the mindset of, yeah, let's go have seconds. And why is that? Why don't people just have the meal? This is something that I've also thought of, like when people have guests over, at least seems to be traditional in Kenya. And this is at different levels. I'm not just saying like, oh, I'm probably in like a bougie place. Like I've gone to different kind of strata in different classes of people, I'd say. And when they have an event and they have people over, they have a thing where it's like, let's have this full meal. You have a wedding, they have like a buffet type of thing. There's that idea of just having the buffet where you just go in, you having a meal, but you can have as many servers as you want. And I'm like, why don't you just do the whole thing? Like I prefer when you have weddings and things like that. Even just when you have guests over, why don't you just serve a dish, serve a plate of food where it's like, okay, you get the appetizer, you get the actual meal itself, you get the dessert, and it's one serving that fits the person. Why is that whole idea of having multiple? So that is one thing. And that is not something that is a common thing. That is a rather recent thing. I shall leave a link below to this site. This is ourworldindata.org. It's a good site. It just gets different data together, and I think it's pretty useful for different things. I'm going to read this. Caloric supply by region. The most widely used and comprehensive data on food supply and consumption is published by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. This data is annually available and is updated by the FAO extending back until 1961. In this chart, we see the average daily supply of calories measured in kilocalories per person a day by world region. From 1961 to 2013. We have defined the FAO's dietary energy/protein/fat supply in our data quality and definition section. Note that supply figures do not include consumption level waste, i.e. that wasted at retail, restaurant, and household levels. Or that's wasted. I think it should be that's wasted. I don't know. and therefore represents food available for consumption at the retail level rather than actual food intake. And a little aside for this, it is unfortunate thing with a place here like Kenya, where I'm at right now, recording this from, is in Western Kenya, where my ancestors are from. The tribe, Luya tribe, is in that area. It's a lot of rain, but then you have people in northeastern, which is very dry. But due to lack of infrastructure and just the abilities of transporting foods from one location to another, and also things like cultural, dietary limitations, or the things that they like. This is the food that we eat. Like, I literally, this thing still occasionally makes me cringe from just remembering when I first saw it. Some starving woman in some hut in some arid desert area talking about how we don't eat fish in our culture, so we can't have this fish that's been brought to us. I'm like, what kind of mentality is that keeps you that I'd rather starve than actually eat this nutrition? Anyway, so that is there. Just having that lack of infrastructure to actually get certain food to another location can be a thing that actually leads to some of this. As I said, this is the ability. This is the calories accessible. This is the access to having seconds, or even that first, versus actually just having. Because the seconds, I guess, would be excess, where you already have enough nutrition, but then there's excess actual calories on the table that you can partake in more if you actually choose to have it. Okay, so overall, we see that per capita calorie supply has been increasing consistently at the global level over this period. However, these trends vary across the world's regions. Caloric supply across Europe and Oceania has been approximately constant over this 50-year period, whilst across all other regions, supply has increased. This increase has been most significant across Asia and Africa, whilst in North America, supply has approximately plateaued from 2000 onwards. The steeper rise across poorer regions of the world means that over the last few decades, global trends in caloric supply have been converging. In terms of food supply, we live in a more equal world today than in the previous century. At the beginning of this entry, we have seen this huge gap between the rich and the poor within countries. Now we see that similarly, I'm always weird with that word, similarly. I always go similarly instead of, there's no I there, so it should be similarly to what has happened within countries. We are now experiencing constantly decreasing inequity across the world. And I think that's a positive thing. And here it goes back to Asia. This is back in 1961. And this is, I think they're going back to as far where they have actual data, because on other charts below here, they'll have some way they go back to 1705, and they just don't have that data for what was happening in Africa in 1705, but they have it for somewhere like in France or something like that. They don't even have it in somewhere like in the United States of America for what I saw on that chart. So anyway, so 1961, Asia was 1,805, so 1,805. Africa was 1,993 calories. The world in general at that time was an average of 2,196. So Africa and Asia were below the average at that time. South America was 2,329. North America was 2,973. Western Europe was 3,116. And Eastern Europe was 3,110. That's, again, accessible. So that's in 1961. That's what it was. Now let's come up to 2013. Africa is 2,624. Asia is 2,779. The world is 2,884. So Asia and Africa are still below the world average, although the world average has gone up about 700 calories. South America is 3,027 calories. Eastern Europe is 3,291 calories. Western Europe is 3,490 calories. And North America is 3,663 calories. Now I'm going to go into some specifics here, but as mentioned, another reminder again, these are calories available at retail for your average American. Like it's saying these are the calories that people can purchase and obtain every single day, apparently, versus the number of people on average in that place. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person in the United States of America in this other chart right here in 2013 was having 3,682 calories a day. It means that there's some people who are having something like 10,000 calories a day, And then there are other people who are having 1,000 calories a day, or half of what the top average, or I'm sorry, half of what the average Kenyan has available, which is 2,206 calories in 2013. Now with Kenya, they have the stats here, and I'm going to go to some countries that I've actually lived in. Going down to 1934 was when they start, and this is also with China. I haven't lived in China, but I want to add this to give people an idea of just the country China. I think China is becoming something that people are a lot more aware of, but to understand some of the issues that were going on in China. They look at it as a world superpower, but it's still considered a developing nation in many actual figures and terms. And not too long ago, the Great Leap Forward and other things, people were living in horrific situations. Still, majority of the country is still living in very, very abject poverty. And for them to be at the level that they're at is part of why you don't see Chinese people complaining as much for some of the horrific things that we're seeing. Because in comparison to what they had just not that long ago, it was horrible. And here we have 1934 for the actual information. That's when the information starts for China and Kenya. You have certain places that have not been plugged into this whole data sphere or information sphere. So it kind of is a dark country, just how Africa in general is considered the dark continent of some parts of it, sub-Saharan Africa, where we just didn't know what was happening in those places. So some of these figures is kind of hard. So for both of them, they had them at the starting point in 1934 with 2,230 kilocalories. And then now in 2013, China is up to 3,108 kilocalories, and Kenya is up to 2,206. So with Kenya, it seems to have dipped down for some time. It went up in 1979, it had gone up for Kenya, and then it dipped down to 1,886 in 1993, and then it's now back up. It's now actually lower, apparently, than what was actually there available on a day-to-day basis in 1934. So I don't know how they did those stats. Now, when it comes to China, in 1960, it dipped down to 1,453 calories, and now in 2013, it's up to 3,108 calories. So it's a massive difference going up in just a matter of 50 years. The amount of change of life that's happened there. Now you look at a place like United States of America, and you go back to, let's say we go back to the date of 1934 where they had these original ones. I have 1930 here. It was at 3,440 calories. That's how it was at that time when China and Kenya had 2,000 around that, 2,200. You go back to 1800 in the United States of America, and it's 2,952 calories. That's higher than anywhere it is here so far for Kenya, but it's China just passed the 2,000 level back in around 2003. Around there was when they were passing that point that America had access-wise in 1800. Now you have Italy that was down below. The lowest one you have here in Italy is 1870. That was at 2,647. And then now you have it up above 3,500. Here for France, you have 1,657 way back in 1705, and then it surpassed the level that Kenya and China were in the 1960s in 1840, and then it's been up ever since then. It seemed to have dipped down somewhere here in 1847 to 2,357, and what was going on in Europe at this time? Because Italy here has also dipped down to 2,249. What was going around in the 1940s? Yeah, the Great World Wars. The World Wars were going on at that time. So you have people who are living, essentially, Kenya supposedly has less access to actual calories today than Europe did during the World Wars, like right after the World Wars. That is a big discrepancy. That is a big, and while the World Wars were going on in Europe, it only dropped down to around 2,000 a day of access. Yet in China, with a Great Leap Forward and things like that, it dropped down to 1,453. So just look at the differences that happen with certain things. Even during a war, with a more freer economy, free market economy, you have that high. Now, post the war, yes, China was also involved in the war. There's also things that were going on in there. But the Great Leap Forward, certain policies, communist policies and things like that, will just get you to the starvation levels. So I think that's a good transition to the other kind of slogan that I thought of. And thank you for listening. And probably wind this down. After this, might read just a short thing after this one. Okay, so this is another another slogan or another thing, talking point that I thought about this whole hashtag waste gap movement that I'm trying to push out there. I'm not really trying, whatever. So there are more people in the world than ever who only have a meal or less a day, while Americans have three. This is the evil that is capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and access to abundant energy from fossil fuels. Okay, so that's a general thing. And one of my friends come on to was like, do people in Africa think we're pigs? And okay, Africa is it's just a massive place. And the questions like that, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, things like that, let's put that aside. But yeah, but sure, some people in Africa look at that and think, yeah, you're kind of pigs, but most people in Africa, I think, in general, don't really have that much free time to actually be going on and looking and comparing and saying, look at that country. Because a lot of people, I think, if you ask them who are aware of the United States of America, would want to emigrate or would want to have certain of those policies that they have there compared to the policies that they have in their location, no matter what they say. Just how some people in the United States of America look at Africans and say these are savages. I'm sure those exist, but specifically on obesity, I'll speak to that for some time. And I think there was a thing where being obese in Kenya there's definitely far fewer obese and big people in Kenya than in the rest of the world than they are. I think it's like the United States of America. Mexico is up there. I think even when you go to Europe, and I've lived in Italy, I've lived in France, there are not that many big people out there. Now, Britain, I think specifically in like London, the bigger cities, they have really high obesity rate there. But then you look at these places, and it's not specific to one race. It's more the access to the actual calories in that place and the education system. I think that's part of it, like this whole like food pyramid. And just people there's issues that go behind that actual thing, and you see it across the board. But I think Mexico, United States of America, the UK, and maybe Canada has some of the highest numbers. I think Australia might be catching up. I don't know. So there's that aspect of it. So I don't know how much they actually look at it, but that is one thing that is definitely noticeable. That is one thing I will mention to you if you haven't traveled and lived outside of the United States of America for some time, when you come back, after being out for a while, that is the rotundness that you actually see, that waist gap that you actually see, is something that is kind of striking. You get back, you're like, wow, there's some hefty people out here. Like, that's one thing that you really notice. When you go to stores, and like big and tall stores, those sizes are kind of the same. Like, you buy like a large t-shirt in the rest of the world, it's not the metric system, like the difference with those things. It's just people are smaller in the rest of the world in general than they are in the United States of America. But I don't think they think of them as pigs in general. But back to my whole quote thing with the whole 3 meals a day thing. That is something new. And that is something that is thanks to certain things that the United States of America has that the rest of the world does not. And I think those are positive things. There's definitely abuses of it. I think I had this series about the 7 deadly clowns, which is based on the 7 deadly sins. And I think the primary sins are greed and gluttony. And I think you look at the actual things that are behind these and why do they turn into sins, the actual emotions or impetus or driving things that the different sins are talking about, I think are only negative when you go to too much, when you go to the excess, when you have a greed or gluttony of any of those things. Like, there's nothing wrong with taking in food, getting nutrition. But when you get to the point where you have the greed, where you're like, I need to keep it away from other people or somehow take in too much to yourself, be a glutton and eat past the point where you're actually sated and your body actually needs fuel, then it's negative for other people and for yourself as well. When you're like, oh, let's just market this thing out there to people for whatever reason. And I think that's a good transition into the next actual reading that I'm going to have here, which is something from this. This is a site that might be a little bit biased, because it's omaddiet.com. And OMAD, for those who don't know, is a 1 meal a day movement. And it's a new dieting. People say it's a new dieting trend, but I think it's something that's been more common. I think it's more common in the world. As I mentioned that thing, there's more people in the world today for many various reasons. Awesome reasons, because human flourishing is something that I am for. Team Human, hashtag Team Human. That's a real hashtag that I want to push out there. So there's more humans. So technically, there are more people. So since as I mentioned, the floor is the floor, people not eating, people having one meal a day, that is the basic thing. That's how normally life has been. Not even one meal a day, something like maybe 5 meals a week or something like that, because you have days when you're hunting and things. If you look at our hunter-gatherer, if you look at when humans actually existed from the beginning, it was far fewer meals, or we were more like of a grazing type of thing. You'd be walking around, eat some berries here, and then you like go around and you're doing something else. But before you got to the point where you actually had, when we're in hunter-gatherer stage, it wasn't multiple meals a day. Then when we actually started farming and things like that, then you got more stable diets, more stable diets and things like that. You had more regular actual access to nutrition and things like this. So there are many things. So for majority of human history, it has been one meal a day or less, and far fewer humans. But then we've had things like industrialization. We've had access to fossil fuels without energy. We've had capitalism to set up the systems of delivering food to different places, storing food, giving the incentives, reducing the amount of people, the mechanization that has actually entered the fields and things like that. So that has increased the actual amount and access to actual calories that people have. So that has been a positive thing, and that has resulted in more humans. But if you have more people, more human beings, there's going to be more people at that floor. So that gap will continue to grow, because there will always be somebody who's pushing the top, pushing the actual envelope, pushing that increase. There's always going to be somebody at the peak. If the mountain keeps growing, there's always going to be a higher peak than there actually is the base of the mountain. And in general, the way mountains are, they spread out to the side, so there's going to be more and more people at that base. That makes any sense. So, I said this is omaddiet.com, so they have some interest in pushing this, even though I'll also tell you my personal interest and background to this. I have had issues with obesity in my life, and I'm a recovering fat person, and part of that process was getting into better knowledge about the food that I had. I think I have just genetics in general that aid me in putting on muscle and size, and also the fat that comes with it. So depending on what I eat, I think my body responds to it in storing and converting the material pretty well. One thing, I'm looking at just general people in my relatives, my immediate relatives, and we seem to be physically healthy and bigger, on average, than others, families that I've compared in that kind of sense. That makes any sense. This is, I haven't gone to like full on genetic testing and things like this. In my immediate family, I was taller than my brother when I was, I think, around 8 and he was around 10. I was the same height as him. And there was a time where he was following different workout regimens, and for some reason his genetics, he just couldn't put on the weight in the same way. So I think specifically with myself, but I've had that, got obese through depression and other reasons behind that I'm still dealing with and working out of that. And pun intended, I guess, or unintended, but let's keep it in there. Let's say I intended it. But with part of that was intermediate fasting, which is something that I think has now become a part of my life. Ever since I first did the full-on cycle of intermediate fasting and looked into the actual benefits of it. And we all technically intermediate fast. If you just have a regular diet and then you eat in your regular day, you have your 3 meals a day, you wake up, you have breakfast at 7 a.m., and then you go to work, you have your lunch at 12 or whatnot, and you get back home, and then you have your snack or something at 4 or your tea or whatever. Then you go and you have your meal at 10 at night, or by 10 you're done eating and you've had your dessert and everything. And then you go to sleep. Between 10 and 7 in the morning, technically, you are intermediate fasting during that time. You technically are fasting. So it's just about the window. Intermediate fasting doesn't have to have a long window. But the first time I did a full-on one was like, yes, I'm actually consciously intermediate fasting. I had a 6-hour eating window, 6 to 8, would fluctuate sometimes, where I would be eating from 4 p.m. to about 10 p.m. or midnight, and then I wouldn't eat until the next 4 p.m. in the day. So that was 16 hours off, 16 to 18 hours off, depending on what was happening. Pretty much my mindset was, whenever I stop eating on this day, I wait 16 or 18 hours before I eat on the next day. And I would be doing that without even changing the actual foods and things that I was eating. Recently, I just came off a ketogenic cycle where I was doing it a lot more restricted. I was keeping on average at 1,600 calories a day. And then it was OMAD. I was actually having 1 meal a day at around 8. So between 8 and 10, I would eat and then not have nothing else for the rest of the day. And then come back again, 1,600 calories. And I added something that I think I've added to my life as just a personal thing that I'm doing, of fasting on the weekends, where I just don't eat, just drink water on the weekends. And I can supplement with salt and things like that just for different things. I will admit that in this last cycle, I should have kept better track of vitamins and other things, so that was rather restrictive. I felt my energy levels were a lot lower. Now that I've switched back to just more of an intermediate fasting, which is something that I think is just going to be something that's accepted in my life. Before I started any of this, it was like, why do we people have breakfast anymore? Or it's like, why do we drink milk from cows? It's for baby cows. It's not for humans. It's not for full-on adults. Like when a baby human is actually growing, the amount of growth that happens from just drinking the mother's milk is massive. So you're having like 2 double meals and things. This access, I think, a big part of these actual access to calories, I think, can be attributed to just how much milk is available in these different locations, in these different countries. Milk is very calorically dense. I think in general, if you're looking into diets, one of the things, it might be in this article that I read, if you're trying to avoid getting certain, if you try to avoid or try to reduce your actual caloric intake in a day, take liquids with calories out. Try to stick to water as much as possible. That might be one positive thing, because there's this it's a sneaky thing getting in. I also stopped drinking some time back, which is another thing. People go out and like, oh, I'm keeping my diet a certain way, and then now I'm pounding these beers, and those calories kind of sneak in. So there is something with that. So that it might be my bias at this article. I'm just reading the article as what it's written here. It's by Jimmy Schwartz, or is this Swartz? Swartz? It's just Swartz. I feel like saying Schwartz, but then when you say Schwartz, I think that's when it's like SCH or something like that. So I think it's Swartz. So omaddiet.com, Jimmy Swartz, 1 meal a day, a history of how eating evolved. Thank you very much for listening. I think I'm just going to read through the article. I'm not going to give much commentary. I don't know, but here we go. I think we can agree that in today's world, the concept of OMAD diet, or simply eating 1 meal a day, is a concept that certainly raises a lot of questions. These questions can stem from many influences, but most of these thoughts come from a mindset of being trained to eat 3 meals a day. But what if I told you it hasn't always been this way? As a matter of fact, the 3 meal a day mindset has been around for a much shorter time period than you realize. So how is it that we've come so far from eating only 1 meal a day and actually become so dependent on food? To make sense of the way we're eating today, I took a look back in time to understand the evolution of these concepts. Let's take a look at our eating history, why we follow these eating patterns, and how they have evolved. The influence of marketing. And he has here like hot dog, delicious Mexican food, restaurant, best homemade pizza, burgers. Marketing does work. Otherwise, it wouldn't be such a massive industry. People don't know exactly how it works, but it definitely does work. Okay, to the reading. We've grown accustomed to having 3 square meals a day, which include breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As a matter of fact, we've grown to love food so much that we also throw in snacks during the day to simply hold us over until our next full meal. So how is it that we've come so far from eating only 1 meal a day and actually become so dependent on food? He repeated this sentence, and I just want to point this out. I don't know if people are necessarily dependent. I don't know if it's like an addiction or thing like this. The language that he's using here, I don't know if it's part of his marketing to sell this thing on the OMAD diet and things like this, or it's just a technique that he's writing. I don't know. But anyway, back to the reading. Manufacturers and marketers have pushed many of the food habits we have today. Add in the simple fact that everywhere we turn there is a fast food chain, new treats, and easy access to snack machines. It has become obvious how this trend has originated. Okay, another aside. There's some grammar issues and things like the way a person speaks. Some of the things they're saying, I don't know if it's obvious, but maybe they're actually going to indicate this. Like one thing is, as I mentioned, stop drinking. I still have the same access to alcohol. There's still as many bars there in the world to actually drink. Doesn't mean you have to get the actual drink. So yes, it's actually there, but people should have impulse control and have some controls on the things. There's many things that are available and are being sold to us at all times, but we don't go out and purchase every single one of those things. So I don't think it's just the manufacturing and marketers. The manufacturing and marketers actually, like, you can't manufacture and market people getting punched in the face. I guess you can with the UFC or something like that, mixed martial arts. But then how many takers will actually join that? If it was like, yeah, we're going to get you, because it's very easy. You can probably find people, hire people. You can probably employ people to punch other people in the face. And you can say, look, just pay this person $2 a day and they'll punch you in the face. Most people will be like, nah, we're not going to do that. I don't know what kind of marketing kind of actual process, you'd actually need to convince people that they should do that. So there has to be some kind of need, and it's just a general demand that we have of just wanting calories. And again, they might actually get into this, so let me just keep reading and see. Okay, so we also can't forget that we can always supersize our meals by simply paying more. It wasn't always this way. As a matter of fact, the one meal a day mantra or lifestyle was one which our ancestors followed. It was not only our prehistoric ancestors, but this was the case for several centuries to follow as well. Think of the world that they lived in. There were no fast food chains or prepackaged meals you pop into the microwave, and the concept of buying a candy bar when they were hungry simply wasn't a possibility. The one meal a day lifestyle was one they had to adapt to since food was so scarce. Since they were hunting and gathering the foods they ate, they simply didn't have the luxury of one meal a day. Not only was one meal a day the manner in which most people ate throughout history, but it was also the case for a majority of history. That seems like a repetition of what they said before. I don't know. Maybe I should have thought about editing this thing first. Okay, this pertained to all different cultures which we see throughout the world. Breakfast. For a majority of our history, breakfast simply wasn't a food we consumed. See, like this one, I don't think breakfast is a food. Breakfast is literally just break fast. You can have anything for breakfast. I guess he's talking about certain breakfast foods, and that's another thing. If I tell you, hey, you want to go out for breakfast, depending on the culture and place that you've lived in, you probably think of different foods in your mind. I think what I'm going to do here is pause, and then I'm going to read and review the different areas and just give you some points. So it talks about breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then finish up with the last two sections. So it's mentioned about how there was actually different aspects here of religion and other things that were actually constraining the amount of that people could eat. So even if they had access to the food, they had certain belief systems that would actually change it. So the concept of breakfast breaking the fast, as I mentioned before, we all kind of do an intermediate fast. The first meal you eat is breakfast. So when I was intermediate fasting and my first meal was at 4 or be at 8, that is technically breakfast no matter what I actually eat. So that started in the period in the 17th century, and they were talking about here aristocratic classes could consume up to 24 dishes during one sitting in the morning hours. Now, with some of those things, that's aristocrats. Aristocrats were what percent of the population was that had that kind of access to food? In general, just the general food that we have access to, even here in Kenya, your average Kenyan has more access to food than on average the most wealthy people had in 100 years ago. Now, when you go back even further than the aristocrats, pretty much most of the dishes aristocrats had, the richest of the rich, when it was like 1.00, or when it was like 0.00001% of the population were these aristocrats, and they had that, you had access to this. Even now, the aristocrats, the wealthiest of the wealthy, sure, they have some meals where it's like this absurdly wealthy amount of money they spend on it. But in general, if you listen to this, there is a chance you have access to eating pretty much anything like Queen Elizabeth of Britain could have. There's different actual things on YouTube where different cooks and things like that come on and show the meals that she likes. And some of the things are regular fare, but the other things you can make, or you can go to a restaurant and get something quite similar. Now, the next one, he moves on to lunch, and it mentioned before in breakfast that in general, that one meal a day type of thing, most people used to have it around noon, at least like in Rome. He's talking about different civilizations, and that is in part because you're waking up, you get that energy, you're doing the work, and then that tides you over to the rest of the work you have to do in the day. It's a lot of manual labor and things like that. And that is another thing. Part of the reason why the obesity levels is different, even if you have higher amounts of access to calories in certain countries, in certain locations, people were eating, I think, breads and things like that a lot more in the past. There was a lot more manual labor. Yet in the United States of America, there's a lot of people who sit at home on their couches, and they get in a vehicle, which is basically a moving couch, and they go to an office, and they have a job that's rather sedentary as well. So the amount of actual spending, actual caloric expenditure in a day has gone down, yet as you see the actual level of caloric access in that chart on the ourdata.org that I read has stayed the same. So since you have less people spending less actual energy, less calories, yet eating the same amount of calories, you have the obesity level going up. And they have here talking about in 1750s, the Earl of Sandwich would order workers to bring him meats in between bread, and we know this today as the sandwich, so it was actually named after a person. He's talking about the World War here, talking about the different access to food that I mentioned before. When he gets to dinner, he does tie in something that is a practical thing to think about, talk about the Industrial Revolution and things like that. With electrification. if there was actual artificial lighting, it was cheaper to actually be able to be awake at night, then certain people would start moving their meals back further into the day. And okay, even if we're having one meal a day, maybe we'll have it later. Or if we have something, you can have it further and later. And then you go into like the microwavable meals and things like that in the 1950s, or the TV dinners tied in, or people were sitting in front of TV, so you're going to have this kind of thing. So yes, with this, you see there was different things happening in the world, and then there was different accesses and different niches. And they're like, oh, if you're going to eat, when you eat at this time. So people are selling you things. It actually is a marketing thing. But it's also the people themselves had some demand for that product, and there was actually other tie-ins, like with TV and things like this, to actually tie that meal in to that actual time. The next section they talk about here is processed food and ready-to-eat meals. So we think he's just talking about what happens. I have some suspicions to what happens to meals when they're put in the microwave. Even when I'm reheating food, I prefer to actually reheat it on the stove or in an oven versus putting things in the microwave. Even when it comes to like just boiling water, there's something suspicious about the way the actual atoms and elements of it are accelerated in the microwave. Like essentially just being bombarded by forms of radiation to vibrate and create heat, versus when you have a convection oven, which is just, I think it just heats it in a more practical sense. It seems better. It seems to even taste better to me. It could just be a personal thing. I think you might have actually seen that as well. Okay, they're talking about with more food comes more health problems and health risks. And I think he's talking about here about the different things, the changes that people are acting different, physical, actual expenditure is different versus the actual thing. Processed food itself, the actual matter and content, the caloric content that it has is going to be less in some cases due to how the food is stored and manufactured. And not to mention just the actual food itself, the process that the processed food actually goes to actually being processed. Because think of something like, you have certain cultures, certain communities that are more susceptible to certain diseases because they're just not exposed to that certain thing. And everything is just a chemical. Chemicals are just chemicals. Everything is made out of chemicals. Anything you ingest is just chemicals in a certain arrangement that when you change this arrangement, it can change from something that is nutritious to poisonous. And you have certain communities that are more lactose intolerant. I think the Asiatic communities. Why is it? You have certain communities that seem to get drunk a lot faster. I think that was something that was seen with the Native Americans. They had less of a resistance towards alcohol. Now, this could be a thing that I think with processed foods, with them being rather recent with some of the things that are being done to the actual foods, I think the odd thing about this is, maybe it's not odd, and maybe you see there's less, there's more correlation with this. People will talk about it. Oh, they're talking about the organic food movement. Oh, we need GMO foods need to be stopped. But I think GMO foods in general are still just something where it's like, okay, we're going to create this potato that is pest resistant from the basic pests that normally get into potatoes, and then somebody will be like, oh, that's a GMO food, that's messing it up. I will say there is something, and I don't know if this is due to how the food is stored, but in general, fruits in the United States of America do taste different than fruits here in Kenya. And the fruits here in Kenya, I think that is more due to the ripening thing, due to how they're actually stored. Because in the United States of America, your average fruit that you're going to get has been picked unripe from wherever it's been shipped from, and then it's taken to a ripening center where it's some kind of there's some element that's sprayed on it to ripen it and get it to the same kind of taste and look level. So when it's in the store, people like that on-demand thing and don't like actually keeping fruits. But here, when I go buy mangoes, when I go buy fruits and things like that, you'll find some that are just completely raw and some that are overripe. So it depends on you to actually get it, and you actually wait with like avocados and things like that, or get them off trees, or you'll buy them, and you let them ripen over some time. And I think that should be brought back because there is something about that. But anyway, so I don't know. There could be something in processed foods that are epigenetically, our genetics, our genes are still not able to deal with these things in the best way. So that one I do have some suspicions. So why did food catch on was another section that he's talking about wealth. It grew out of simplicity, idea of more is more. We see it everywhere. I had questions over that. A look through history dictates why one meal a day is healthier. I'm suspicious about looking back into history and saying like whatever we see back then. That was done in different ways. Nah, not quite sure. Here it says, why is one meal a day better than three? And I said I was going to read the last two sections. I'm probably not going to. At least this is the second to last section. I shall not read it. Shall just give you an overview. Talking about the different benefits. And they were talking about certain things, how, you just spend less time with food. But depending on where you are, let's say you live in New York City with the number of restaurants and access to food that they had, processed foods and things like this, before the shutdown with the pandemic, have a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine, Stephen, who's been in the food industry in New York area. And if you want to listen to more about that, should be here on my channel, or you can find it. But they had this thing on like how much time you're spending on actual food. If you're having 3 meals a day versus if you're having 1 meal a day. But depending on that meal a day, it could actually take a lot more time on that 1 meal than 3 meals. Let's say you have 3 meals and you're like going to McDonald's, you're ordering in pizza. When you want to eat, you're still doing all these other things. But then the second the delivery comes in, the food's already ready, you eat it. But if you're having 1 meal a day and it's a pizza, the amount of prep time to actually make the dough, get the actual toppings, grate the cheese, or let's say you're making the cheese by yourself. So there's all these things. If you're getting to more organic, more actually cooking yourself, you could still spend the same amount of time on 1 meal a day. You can spend more time on making 1 meal a day than you do if you're actually having 3 or even 4 meals, or however many meals a day. So he finishes off with talking about summarizing what he had written, about why did we follow these eating patterns, talking about how the opens up with saying, although most of this concept of eating 1 meal a day grew out of the aristocratic societies, today it is simple to find tasty, cheap meal options, giving us more reasons to eat. I don't think you need more than a reason to eat besides that you can, and it's there. So I guess more chances, times to eat would be something. But I shall wind this down here. End up being a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I don't know which was good to read. I just had that initial quote, and I'll get back to that again here. That was about the waste gap, and then now we turned into this whole conversation about these other things. So let me know what you think about these things. Have you tried changing your diet, either the amount of meals or the types of foods that you eat? What kind of research did you actually go through to actually understand that? What do you think about this as a comparison to people talking about the wage gap or the earnings gap or the wealth gap? Do you get what I'm trying to say here? Like, ground level is always going to be ground level. And if a mountain keeps growing, the peak will always be higher. You're always going to have that. The level of achievement will always increase. And that is positive for, I think, the entire human race. Let's say you have the increasing amount of X, and a core inherent feature of X is to be Y. And yet X can also be Z if X puts in certain effort, then you're always going to have an increasing number of Y because the Y is the default state. I could probably say that more human beings died today, on this day today. We have a higher number of people died. Probably exponentially more people died today than died in 1800. I can say more people will die in 20 years from now than were alive 2,000 years ago. But that's because there's actually just more people. That actually doesn't say anything about the general quality of life of the humans living at those times. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind. So if I say there are more people starving in the world today, discounting what people define as starving, like I'm literally starving right now and I just had a meal and you're not actually starving. Talking about the actual biological sense of your body is beginning to actually eat away at its own physical reserves, its own muscle, its own fats and things like that, because you don't have any supplementary calories for your body to actually get energy from. Today, right now, there are more people in the world that are in that condition than they were 100 years ago. I think even 100 years ago, 1920, most definitely 200 years ago, I would say that. That does not necessarily make any statement about the actual quality of the cultures and the level of general human flourishing that exists. I think more can be done to increase the actual ability for people to obtain the calories they now have access to, but that is more due to mutations in the actual distribution systems of these things. You have certain locations where food goes to waste, as I mentioned earlier, because we just don't have the ability to actually get food from point A to B, because the people who have monopolized the ability to create those roads and create those systems are just incompetent and they just need to let other people do it. On the flip side, you have places where the food is actually there, but the people who have the food are restricted from giving it to the people who need the food because there's something that goes with like, hey, you can actually get sued. Like there's people where there's homeless people who actually can sue a restaurant or something, or you can get sued if somebody comes to your dumpster and gets food out of it. And there's things that go in there that are frustrating, and I get that kind of frustration, But just saying there is a gap, and because gap means this thing bad and humans bad, we need more actual influence to redistribute these things in these certain ways. When it's like, hey, maybe that influence you're calling for is part of the reason that this actual situation actually exists to begin with. And thanks for listening. It was a longer video, I think, from some of the things I've been posting. I think recently it's been between 10 to 15 minutes around there on average. But now I'm glad I got this. There was a lot of information in here. I think I presented it in a way that I'm comfortable enough with, despite being somewhat disappointed in that All Mad Diet site. But that's it for now. Like, share, subscribe. Let me know of other gaps that you can see that can actually go along with this whole wealth gap type of thing. So that's it for now. Till next time, goodbye. Links to merchandise store somewhere where you can help support the channel by just buying some stuff in there. Until next time, goodbye.